Chapter 5. What if things go wrong? Fear, worry, and catastrophizing. While self-criticism, grievance, and resentment are focused mostly on the past, fear, worry, and catastrophizing are negative thinking projected into the future, ways of paying our negativity forward. Catastrophizing, as the name implies, is creating catastrophes in our mind that don't actually exist in reality. Inventing, imagining, obsessing, and suffering over what could go wrong. And of course, supplementing and accessorizing those imagined catastrophes with what we must do to fend off or recover from them. As a likely catastrophizer himself, author Mark Twain captured it well when he reportedly said, "I am an old man and have known a great many troubles, but most of them never happened." We experience so many awful and terrifying situations, spend years actively living through one disaster after another, and yet much of the horror we experience hasn't happened and won't happen in real life. It doesn't exist anywhere but inside our own mind. Ramona is a fourth-year medical student and a classic catastrophizer. Since she entered med school, she's been worrying about and planning for what will happen when she fails her medical boards. She thinks about what restaurant she'll wait tables at and whether she'll end up homeless as a result of her student debt, with no way to pay it back. Ramona lives out these imaginary scenarios as if they were really happening. Back in reality, Ramona is in the top 5% of her medical school graduating class. The probability of Ramona failing her boards is close to 0. And yet, when in the grips of catastrophic thinking, reality is not a factor in determining what the future holds or what's true. The mind is insistent on preparing for the worst and scariest possible outcome, which, no matter how unlikely, is still considered certain. So many of us self-inject fear into our nervous system. We force ourselves to live the worst when it may not happen, and definitely has not happened. Why, when given a blank slate, an unknown future, do we choose to write a story of catastrophe and terror? Facing the unknown. As is the case with self-critical thoughts, which convince us of the certainty of our failure, catastrophic thoughts convince us of the certainty of a disastrous future. Once again, the thoughts stem from feeling out of control and anxious in the face of uncertainty, the uncertainty of what the future will actually hold. Faced with the predicament of an unknown future and nothing to do about it, we inject the situation with something we're more comfortable with, something we know, the certainty of doom. Once we know it's all going to go badly, we've solved the real problem. And, as an added bonus, our mind can now get busy with its favorite activity, worrying about and planning for the disasters headed our way. The anxiety of the unknown has been successfully replaced with the far more understandable anxiety of what we have to do about the impending catastrophe. Some people, when faced with the discomfort of the unknown, choose to fill in the unknown with a gloriously positive story. It's going to be a huge success. We are going to get everything we want and more. And yes, if we're going to think up a story about the future, why not invent a fabulous one rather than a horrific one? But if we genuinely want to be free from excessive thinking, we need to accept that neither storyline, not the positive or the negative one, is actually true. The future is unscripted. Both storylines are efforts to create a sense of control. Our what if, when it comes to the future, is really just a replacement for the what. What will it be? We don't know. There's nothing for us to do with a reality that's not yet a reality. We can't micromanage what doesn't exist. We just have to wait in the not knowing. The more lost you are in what-if thinking, the more you need to pull yourself out of the future and ground yourself in this moment, now, in the choices you're making today. This begins with being able to accept feeling uncertain. There is an urgency to practicing "I don't know," because when we've convinced ourselves the future is a disaster, we stop attending to the actions we need to take in order to make our desired future possible. When we get caught up in what-if thinking, we feel helpless and doomed, and as a result, disconnected from our present reality and our part in it. We've forgotten that how we behave today has everything to do with what tomorrow will bring. Forgotten that we have agency and are part of the creation of our future. When we're catastrophizing, we're not only escaping from uncertainty, but we're also escaping from our current responsibilities. We are avoiding what we need to be focusing on to create the future we want. What's particularly strange and baffling about this form of negative thinking is its utter senselessness. Life already contains enough catastrophes, real ones to live, without our having to think up any of our own. We don't need to create a disaster wait list of potential horrors to keep us busy. Life is chock full of unforeseen and scary realities without any help from us. It's true that we can't control what's to come, but we can certainly affect it with the actions we take today. And so, when my client, Ramona, falls into the trenches, into a future in which she's a homeless person with unsolvable debt, I ask her how much time she spent studying for her boards that day, and whether she thinks it's enough time. Catastrophic thinking is challenged by boots on the ground, reality-based investigation. Ask yourself, am I doing everything I can right now to make the future I want possible? Have I left no stone unturned? What am I not focusing on, because I have determined it's a hopeless future? Maybe it's time to turn your attention to taking the steps you can take now. All you can ever do is your part at this moment. Breaking free from excessive thinking means not only resisting the urge to create a storyline about the future, but also actively doing everything you can to create the outcome you desire. Pay attention to how you're behaving now and surrender the results. Listen to that sentence again. Efforts to be prepared. Catastrophic thinking, furthermore, is a way to prepare ourselves for potential disasters. Our negative thinking loops, we imagine, help us stay fit, so we're ready for hell when hell arrives. We think through every possible negative scenario to make sure we won't be surprised or ambushed by the future when it arrives. Catastrophic thinking is a misguided attempt to keep ourselves armed and ready. Once again, however, we must inquire as to whether our mental preparations are actually helpful when it comes to handling negative outcomes if and when they do arrive. Does pre-living a disaster make us any better or more equipped to live it when it's here? In reality, the only thing we accomplish with our what-if thinking is to make sure that we get to experience the disaster at least once. With our what-if rehearsal, we know we won't have to miss out on the experience of disaster, even if it never happens in real life. But in such preparations, we exhaust ourselves mentally and emotionally, deplete our nervous system, as we force our mind and body to run through the catastrophe that may never happen. I've never heard a single person say, "Oh, I'm so glad I worried about this disaster ahead of time. Wow, that worrying is really helping me navigate this disaster now." So, too, I've never come across a case when the catastrophe the person was replaying in their head was the same catastrophe that played out in real life. The disaster we imagine is never the exact shape or color of the one that comes, if one comes at all. Regardless, our preparations are for naught. We're always preparing for something different than what shows up. Practice probability. Catastrophic thoughts simultaneously hijack our present moment and hold us hostage with fear. When we catastrophize, we effectively take a fresh and unsuspecting now and blow it up with negative projections. Our projections may be about the future, but they are alive here, now. We're thinking about the disastrous future in this moment. Our fear-based future-related thoughts poison the present moment and turn it into something that it isn't, something both dreadful and imaginary. When we've convinced ourselves that something terrible is headed our way, usually we've lost touch with probability. Probability is a simple but sturdy approach. It can serve as our life vest in the tsunami of catastrophic thinking. Sarah and I had been working together for a long time, and I knew her inner hypochondriac well. Sarah spent a lot of time thinking about illness, and had convinced herself on many occasions that she was suffering from one terminal condition or another. Any new sensation or physical change led her to frantically search the internet for an explanation. Soon after, she was convinced that she didn't have long to live. I had traversed this cycle with Sarah many times, and each time she descended fully down the rabbit hole, getting her proverbial affairs in order. Sarah was extremely committed to and fully invested in her catastrophic thoughts. In her mind, the thoughts were not just thoughts, but cold, hard reality. During one of these trips down the rabbit hole, Sarah's mind was suffering with what she believed was a terminal autoimmune condition, a disease that was not only very rare, but mostly found in people 50+. She was in her 30s. I proposed the following. Since we didn't know for sure that she was dying from this condition, and since her symptoms could have been a result of a variety of possibilities, for now, was she willing to just go with probability? Until we had heard evidence that proved otherwise, could we give ourselves permission to assume what was statistically most likely? Remarkably, with this simple approach, Sarah was able to calm down and release her grip on her what-if thinking. Just for now, she was going to let the numbers win, let the probable be her reality. Patty's catastrophic thoughts, on the other hand, had convinced her that her teenager was never going to get into college. She would be lying on the couch watching TV for the rest of her life in Patty's living room. This mom was already trying to figure out how she would be able to vacation without guilt and leave her daughter behind on the couch, already worrying how she would figure out dating with her daughter's limp body forever present in the house. I first asked Patty if she could just acknowledge that she was caught in a pretty fierce storm of what-if thinking, an unknown and uncertain future filled with certain disaster. I invited her to take a break from the storyline and offer herself a bit of compassion for how difficult a place she was in at this moment. Not the difficulty of what she was imagining, but the difficulty of being trapped inside this what-if thinking loop. She could, and the tears came. After a few minutes, I asked if she was also willing to consider the probability of this scenario, not as determined by her current catastrophic mind, but rather by the statistics for what had happened before at her daughter's school. Had any of the students ever failed to get into college? And if so, how many students? She told me that it had never happened. I asked if she agreed that the probability was low that her daughter would be the first person in the history of the school to get in nowhere. Again, she agreed. I then asked if there were colleges that accepted pretty much anyone, regardless of grades. Another yes. Emboldened by her progression, I asked a final question. Was she willing to live in the probability that she and her daughter weren't that different from everyone else who had walked this path before her? Could she rest in what was strongly probable, at least until we received information that proved otherwise? She was on board, And within moments, the catastrophic thoughts melted out of her awareness. Deborah, on the other hand, suffered with a brand of catastrophic specialness, which served to support her what-if thinking. She had convinced herself that she would have some never-before-seen reaction to a drug that the doctor gave her following a minor surgery. Undoubtedly, her body would react to this well-proven medicine in a way that was different than the millions of people who had taken the drug over decades. When I asked her why she thought she was so different than everyone else, why she was so negatively special, she laughed. The idea that we are the cursed one, the despicable one, and yet the cursed and despicable one at the center of the universe, that what is true for us is so different from what is true for everyone else, is part of what keeps our what-if thoughts in power. We need to remind ourselves that we are not so unique and special when it comes to misfortune. If it's so for other human beings, chances are it's so for us as well. When confronted with a situation that's unknown, we can actively choose to go with probability over our distorted imagination, to hang on to history in the face of uncertainty, and to remember that we're not so different from everyone else. Ask yourself, is there a situation right now where I would benefit from considering the probability of what I'm imagining will happen actually happening? If so, take a moment and lay out the external reality, with no story added on, as a replacement for the story inside your mind. Just get through now. Susan and her husband had decided they were going to divorce. It was a sad and stressful time. Neither of them was happy about the decision, but as they saw it, there were no more options. With 3 young kids and shared property, 1,000 things needed to happen to unravel this 2-decade-long relationship. Their lives were intertwined in every way imaginable. Understandably, Sue was frightened and filled with anxiety and dread. Her entire life was going to change, and she knew it. Her thoughts, in trying to find something she could control in a situation that felt entirely out of control, were fixating on the most minute details. The decision to divorce wasn't a week old, but Sue's thoughts were frantically looping on what babysitters could take her daughter to school, how she would get the laundry basket up the stairs with her bad back, and where the air conditioning switch was located so that in 6 months, when summer came, the house would be cool. Faced with the enormity of what was happening, Susan's mind grabbed onto the tasks that would have to be figured out later, but which couldn't possibly be figured out now. When we can't stop thinking about all the things that will need to be figured out at some point in the future, it can be an act of supreme self-kindness to remind ourselves that we only have to, and only can, in fact, manage the situation for today. Just today. We cannot figure out what will be needed or wanted in the future. We don't have the information to decide that yet. So it's best to not go there until we know more. And when we do go there, we don't have to do it alone. We can ask for help. Other people have walked through whatever we're walking through, and we can call on those resources. When we feel overwhelmed or scared, we need to give ourselves permission to stop figuring out the future and focus on today, to stop asking ourselves to know anything other than what's needed right now. We only have to get through this moment now. We can say to ourselves just for today, "Sweetheart, take this one day at a time." This attitude and these sorts of words, offered with kindness and compassion, can grab us by the scruff of the neck and pull us straight out of the thinking hole of anxiety, fear, and despair. Help the imagined scenario reach resolution. If we look closely, catastrophizing writes the future disaster script only to the point in the story when the catastrophe happens. Because we're hardwired to overestimate threats and underestimate our resources and abilities for dealing with them. We fail to write the part of the script that has us attending to the disaster itself. It can be useful, therefore, to write more, not less. That is, to keep going, playing the movie out in your head past the point where we normally run out of the theater in terror. When you give yourself the chance to think about what you would do if the disastrous situation you're imagining were to happen, you can come up with some possible solutions or actions to take. Perhaps you may even have dealt with something similar in the past. If not in reality, then most probably in your head. Ask yourself, let's say this happens. Then what? What would or could I do? What might be a next right step? Is there anyone I could ask for help? Have I ever faced something equally challenging in the past? If so, what helped me then? When we imagine what we would do if a catastrophe really did happen, sometimes we can't imagine anything at all. One of my clients keeps enough sleeping pills in her medicine cabinet to commit suicide if something terrible were to happen to her child. For her, the solution is that there isn't going to be an after-disaster to address. But it's important to recognize that the person we will be if that disaster happens is not the person who's sitting here now trying to imagine it or figure out a plan. The one who will be reacting to that challenging situation, if it happens, has not been created yet. We haven't yet been changed by the reality of that disaster. And so, if we can't imagine a way through, can't play the movie any further than the catastrophe, that's okay. You won't be then who you are now. That said, you can't know what will be possible or what will help get you through. Vanessa had a dreadful fear of cancer. She was certain that if she ever did get a cancer diagnosis, she would emotionally collapse and die, not of the disease, but of fear. But when the time came that, unfortunately, she did receive the diagnosis, the Vanessa who walked through it, and to its healthy conclusion, was utterly different than the person she had imagined, and unrecognizable from the person who had been fearing it. Life changes who we are, and often a resilience and fortitude appear within us that we just can't imagine from the other side of reality, before they're needed. Exercise: Finding Proof of Resilience. Recall a time from your past when you found your way through a situation that initially felt impossible, or that you would have considered devastating. 1. Consider how you were able to navigate it, or perhaps build a new relationship with the situation, either internally or externally. 2. Contemplate how that difficult situation changed you, what you learned from it, and how it changed your relationship with yourself and the world. 3. Take a moment to explore and acknowledge your own resilience and adaptability. Catastrophic thinking is an attempt to take care of yourself by preparing you for impending doom. But in the process, you discount and dismiss who you really are, your strength and ingenuity, your life experience, your internal resources, and the support system you can tap if need be. If you don't believe me, look to your past for proof. When you combine self-criticism, grievance, resentment, blame, fear, worry, anger, and righteousness, throw in a handful of catastrophic thinking, then shake it up in a mixer called life, you end up with a cocktail of suffering. Once we become aware of our negative thinking loops, what they're trying to accomplish, the imaginary assumptions and beliefs they're built on, the self-identities they support, and the damage they're causing in our lives, we can then choose a path. We can decide for ourselves what we want to engage in with regard to the thoughts our mind is throwing at us. Armed with awareness and self-compassion, we no longer have to bite the hook that our thoughts forever dangle, or, for that matter, award them with a power they don't possess, without our giving it to them. Part 2. Tools for Relief. Chapter 6. Unstick from Sticky Thoughts. Colobacter crescentus, a bacterium that lives in water, holds the title for the stickiest substance on Earth. It secretes a sugary compound 3 times stronger than superglue. A tiny bit of it can withstand the pull of lifting several cars at once. As impressive as this sounds, if it were possible to compare the stickiness of Colobacter to that of thoughts, I would still bet on thoughts as being the stickiest substance on Earth. You've probably noticed that certain thoughts are easier to let go of than others. Thoughts like, what should I have for dinner? What's the weather going to be this weekend? What movie should I see? Aren't usually problematic in terms of shifting our attention elsewhere. There aren't strong emotions, history, or importance attached to these kinds of thoughts. Other kinds of thoughts, however, feel harder or downright impossible to escape. Thoughts connected to hurt, shame, resentment, anger, and other strong emotions. Those tethered to our self-esteem and other strong beliefs. These are the kinds of thoughts that stick and stay stuck to us. Sticky thoughts don't respond to our attempts to stop thinking them. No matter how we try to distract ourselves, scold ourselves for having them, assure ourselves they're not true, replace them with better thoughts, or any other strategy. They just won't let us go, or let us let go of them. It can feel like the thoughts are literally superglued to our brain. These kinds of thoughts require a different approach. Fighting with them, with more thoughts, and other traditional methods, won't work because their glue is stronger than any fight we can wage. But as it turns out, we have a tool that we can use, one that can dissolve the glue that coats our thoughts. We can change the mind, our mind, to which the thoughts are adhering, so the thoughts can no longer latch on to our attention with such ferocity. Awareness is that tool. When we become aware of just how sticky thoughts are, what beliefs empower their stickiness, and why we have so much trouble detaching from them, we are then able to dissolve the stickiness and smooth out the surface of our mind so the thoughts can peel away. This chapter is devoted to the various aspects of ourselves, beliefs, ideas, and conditioning that make us so receptive to the glue of thoughts. With this new awareness, the potential for freedom appears. Believing thoughts are true. We stay stuck in thinking because of what we believe about our thoughts. Put simply, we believe them. We think our thoughts are trustworthy and true. By the very fact of their having appeared, they are deserving of our attention. We mistakenly believe our thoughts matter, regardless of what else we know that might contradict them or make them suspect. With this deep reverence for thoughts, it seems unwise to turn away from them. Why would we reject what we trust most? The mind, maker of thoughts, convinces us that what it's telling us is reality, and consequently that we can't live without its input and without accepting its authority. Thinking is the best thing we've got going for us, or so say our thoughts. In propagating this message, the mind cleverly secures itself as the necessary ingredient for our happiness and survival. We keep thinking excessively, not just because we believe our thoughts, but also because we are convinced that thinking is fundamentally good for us. At the same time, We can't stop thinking because we don't realize we're thinking. We think without any awareness we're doing it. Thinking is always going on in the background and foreground of consciousness. It's the soundtrack to our life. To be thinking is to be alive. Thinking feels like just being. We don't know that silence and space can even exist between thoughts, that we can exist in the absence of thinking. Furthermore, we don't know that thoughts can appear and we can choose to decline their invitation. Decide not to engage in their content. We don't know another way of living other than thinking. Being in love with our thoughts. We don't just trust and believe our thoughts. Truth be told, we are utterly infatuated with thoughts. We find our own thoughts fascinating, delightful, visionary, and brilliant, and are utterly enamored with the contents of our mind. Our thoughts are what make us special. The better the thoughts, the better we are as the one who thought them up. The questions our thoughts raise are of utmost importance and value to us, and must be answered, each one with care and attention. When I asked a self-identified thinking addict what she thought it would be like to experience more gaps between her thoughts, spend less time thinking, she said it would be like asking her to break up with a great lover. Indeed, many of us experience a kind of love affair with thoughts, attending to and valuing them above everything else in our life. Breaking free from our addiction to thinking would mean breaking up with our greatest love, demoting our thoughts from our most favorite thing to something not so special, not so interesting, and possibly not even worthy of our attention. Taking ownership of thoughts. It's odd, really, that we refer to the words we hear in our heads as our thoughts, as if they're something we came up with, make happen, and script. And yet the words we hear, the substance of which we're taking credit or blame for, appear entirely without our consent and without our crafting. Think about it. Would you really choose most of the thoughts that appear in your consciousness? Thoughts appear whether we choose them or not, and whether we sanction their appearance. So, in what way are they ours? Yes, we are the only ones hearing the thoughts, but we certainly have not scripted them, agreed to them, or invited them into our consciousness. Our thoughts are not ours at all, not something we have chosen to create. Rather, they are random bits of content containing characters, emotions, and situations pulled from our life, popping up out of the soup of our own experience, usually for no particular reason. Maintaining the illusion of control. We stay hooked into our thoughts because thinking gives us a sense of control. It makes us feel like we're doing something for ourselves, working on our own behalf. Thinking gives us a sense of agency, makes us feel less vulnerable and afraid, less at the mercy of change and what we can't control. We don't know another way, don't know how to let go of what we see as our lifeboat. We're so heavily invested and reliant upon thinking as the way to keep ourselves safe that we don't stop for long enough to get a glimpse of another way, a way of living that doesn't necessitate constant thinking. We hold the deep conviction that thinking will make whatever we're thinking about better. It's ingrained in us from the time we're born. Thinking is the solution to every problem and non-problem. But what if it's not? What if the premise at the center of everything we believe and do is faulty? What if thinking, the way we do it, is actually the problem, not the solution? Assuming we can control thought. No matter how out of control and random our thoughts may be, still, we believe that we should be able to control them and somehow make them reasonable. This belief that thoughts are ours to control contributes to our difficulty in letting them go. We imagine that if we really wanted to, tried hard enough, we would be able to stop unwanted thoughts from happening, to control our mind and create a life in which only wanted thoughts appeared. We are convinced that we have to keep fighting with thoughts until they go away, and fighting with ourselves for not controlling them better. Ultimately, we can't leave our thoughts alone because we are responsible for their content and responsible for the fact that they're appearing. Fearing invasive thoughts. Healthy, well-adjusted people can experience thoughts that just show up with no rhyme or reason, successfully scare and distract their recipient, and then disappear as randomly and senselessly as they appear. When Kevin is driving, a thought frequently appears in his mind that says, "You are going to swerve this car into someone on the side of the road." Kevin is not homicidal, but has heard the thought since he started driving 30 years ago. For Jane, an accomplished and experienced equestrian, the days leading up to each competition are peppered with thoughts telling her she is going to fall and break her neck, and that these are the last days of walking and breathing on her own. Kimberly's invasive thought is she is going to jump into the subway tracks. She hears this thought almost every day on her commute to work, which leads her to look away from the train and hold on to a pole just in case. Henry's unwanted thoughts tells him during theater performances that he is going to scream out and disrupt the performance, essentially the most inappropriate thing he can think of doing. This thought has been so bothersome and threatening that it caused him to give up seeing theater altogether. While our invasive thoughts may be short-lived in their own right, momentary frightening whispers in the shadows of our mind, nonetheless, we put an enormous amount of time and energy into discounting and disproving them, and trying to make them stop. We consider our thoughts to be far more important than just what they're yammering on about. Additionally, we think it's our responsibility to figure them out, decode their hidden meaning, understand why this particular thought is appearing now. We believe our thoughts hold some deep truth about who we really are, as if, underneath it all, we secretly want to jump in the train tracks, scream out in a theater, or harbor an unconscious desire to be paralyzed. When such disruptive thoughts appear, it then becomes our responsibility to unearth what they're here to tell us. Thoughts, as we imagine them, are a reflection of our unconscious drives and deepest longings, whispers from our soul. If thoughts say it, then it must be real, even if we don't know it yet. If we don't analyze and unravel our thoughts, we will be letting our true nature run amok, giving the green light to our deepest, darkest self. We have to get to the bottom of our thoughts so we can convince them they're wrong about us. If we don't, they will be right about us, and if not now, then soon. At the same time, we think our thoughts have the power to make us do things entirely out of character, abhorrent even to our wishes, morals, and values. While we may have been a kind and decent person our whole life, the appearance of a violent thought makes us feel that deep down we must be a violent person, must want to commit violent acts, and are destined to do so. We give our thoughts the power to override everything we already know about ourselves. We imagine that our thoughts can compel us to act without our consent. Thoughts are more powerful than us. We therefore have to aggressively refute our thoughts and prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that what they're suggesting will not happen. We have to do this again and again to ensure that the thoughts will not come true. But of course, we can't disprove such thoughts because we're operating in the land of, dare I say, crazy. We're in the company of a motherboard without an operator. There is no sense to the system or to these thoughts, yet we continue trying to use sense to disprove what's not real. The thoughts just happen. Why they happen is not a question that will help you recover from them. What we resist persists. When we react to our thoughts as if they hold great importance, the power to make us do things we don't want to do, we turn them into something that matters. Our resistance gives our thoughts something to push against, and in so doing, strengthens them. Our fear and resistance are their fuel. When we stop fretting about our disruptive thoughts, stop fearing them and trying to fight them off, stop investing them with the power to control us, and just accept them as a part of the out-of-order computer that is our mind, the very same disruptive thoughts, with the very same crazy content, cease to be so disruptive. The thoughts may still come, although usually far less often. But we know that we don't need to convince them or ourselves that they are wrong about us. Furthermore, we don't need to know why we don't want to do what they're telling us we want to do. Our thoughts cannot make us do anything we don't want to do. Their appearance in no way suggests that we secretly want to do what they're proposing. Our thoughts aren't privy to any inside story on us. Invasive thoughts are just random firings from an out-of-order computer. Thoughts don't have to mean anything unless we choose to infuse them with meaning. We can actually leave our thoughts alone, allow them to hoot and holler, rant and spew, all the while knowing they cannot turn us into the crazy characters their content may suggest. Fighting with our unwelcome thoughts, blaming ourselves for what's not in our control, doesn't change our thoughts. It does, however, keep us hooked on an unending cycle of thinking and paralysis. Thoughts keep coming, and we keep fearing and fighting with them. But fortunately, we are only responsible for how we respond to our thoughts. When we give up trying to make our thoughts stop, to change what the thoughts are telling us, we may lose the battle against our thoughts, but we will win the war with life. When we accept that thoughts just happen, that they're not our fault and not ours to control, this is victory. This is freedom. Freedom with thoughts, not from thoughts. We can now get on with our life. In the same way we might turn a deaf ear to a disturbed person on the street, randomly yelling insane comments at us, we are wise to employ a similar attitude toward our invasive negative thoughts. We have compassion for that mentally ill person, and yet we don't pull up a chair and sit down with this shouter to try to unpack and analyze the deeper meaning and purpose of their words, show them why they're not appropriate, prove that they're not true. So, too, we don't have to spend our energy discounting or plumbing our thoughts for deeper meaning. Their existence does not imply significance. We can simply acknowledge our inner intruder, our inner crazy, give her a name perhaps, recognize that she snuck her way into the control room. We nod to our crazy intruder, sigh, giggle, grimace, or whatever feels right, and just keep walking. Once again, I repeat, we are not our thoughts. We are the awareness the thoughts are arising to and within. Most thoughts don't matter, and some thoughts really don't matter. Every moment we invest in our unwanted thoughts, every ounce of energy we put into trying to disprove them, is a morsel of time and energy wasted. We are validating and strengthening what's insignificant, a strange, albeit noisy blip in a flawed system. Our thoughts, most importantly, offer us an opportunity to know ourselves more deeply, but not through their content, not by decoding their words as we imagine. Rather, we come to know ourselves by deciding how we want to relate to our thoughts and, paradoxically, when we render thoughts irrelevant. Letting thoughts come and go without engaging with them or falling under their spell, allows us to experience ourselves as the awareness within, which the thoughts are appearing, the awareness that is deciding to let the thoughts go. When we separate from thoughts, we experience ourselves as the consciousness that hears the thoughts, but is not made of them. We know ourselves, therefore, as who we really are. Ignoring deeper causes. In psychology, there's an expression: if it's hysterical, it's historical. If a situation is making you feel particularly emotional or out of control, it's probably related to something you lived at another time, when you were younger, and probably with your early caretakers. The same can be said for your thoughts. If it feels like you're stuck like glue to a set of thoughts, it's probably about something more than just what you're ruminating on, more than what it looks like on the surface. You're stuck because you're trying to figure out or fix an experience from an earlier time in your life, to resolve feelings that were never resolved. You're in relationship with an old wound and a young self, which have been triggered by this current situation and which this thought loop is trying to work out. Once you understand this and stop buying into the storyline the thoughts are spinning, and once you realize that your feelings are not just, and not really, about what your thoughts are telling you they're about, you can then loosen your grip on the situation at hand and ease up on urgently having to solve it. In so doing, you are not only freeing yourself from the particular thoughts you're locked up in, but you're also breaking the addictive thinking patterns that keep you mentally hooked into every new problem that arises. The next time you're caught in a sticky thought loop, obsessing and replaying a situation, when you feel like you positively must figure it out or you can't be happy, stop and ask yourself, what is the felt experience that this situation triggers in me? Am I feeling not heard, not seen, not loved, blamed? Do I feel like I have no voice or no way to protect myself? What can I not make happen? What is the core experience for me in this situation? Once you get a sense of the core experience, continue by asking yourself, have I ever felt this feeling before? If so, with whom? And how? I would also recommend journaling on these questions. What's important is that you get in the habit of contemplating and reflecting on the deeper thread lines behind your thought loops, which will help loosen your attachment to the situation at hand, and what looks like is in the way of your being okay. Once you identify, reflect, and maybe write on the core experience, take a moment to offer yourself some kind words. Place a hand on your heart and remind yourself that what you're experiencing right now matters. Tell yourself, this matters. If you feel unheard, you can say to yourself, I hear you. I care about what you're experiencing. I get it. If you're feeling unloved, you can tell yourself, I love you right here, just as you are. Whatever words soothe the core experience, offer them to yourself. Use this new awareness of the core wound under the sticky thinking as an invitation, above all else, to be fiercely self-loving. Replacing life with ideas about it. When I was a little girl, I believed that a flower was a flower, that this thing I called a flower contained some fundamental essence of flowerness. Why else would we call it a flower? Later, on a family trip to Holland, I discovered that Dutch people called this thing I knew to be a flower a bloem. And later, when we arrived in Spain, the same thing became a flor. I was thoroughly confused. But it's a flower. So why do they call it bloem or flor? Why don't they just call it what it is? I asked my father, not comprehending that the word flower was not the same thing as the extravagantly colored, deliciously smelling entity I so enjoyed. From the time we develop language, we start experiencing life through words, and then, later, ideas and concepts. Once we learn the word flower, then, when we see something that looks like a flower, we immediately think, "Oh, that's a flower," with the implication that we already know what this thing is that we're looking at. Once we attach the label to it, we categorize and conceptualize not just the object, but also the whole experience that is a flower. We assume we already know what it is, and so we stop really looking at it, stop seeing its color, smelling its scent, feeling its texture, noticing its uniqueness. Stop actually experiencing it. We see the object and immediately move into our ideas about flowers, all the information we ever learned about flowers and everything we associate with them, from our first Valentine's Day rose to the flowers we laid on our grandmother's coffin. There's no longer a need, desire, or even awareness of interacting with the flower directly. We have filed it away in our mind's cabinet of ideas, and are now in a relationship with the concept of flower, rather than the flower itself. The lived experience of that flower has been replaced by the idea of it. As we accumulate more language, ideas, and strategies for thinking about life, the distinction between our experience and the words that describe it shrinks and eventually disappears. We start to believe that our thoughts contain the essence of the experience they're describing, interpreting, opining, and conceptualizing. The thoughts about our experience become synonymous with the experience itself. The stand-in becomes the actor. Just as I, as a young person, believed that the word flower was the same thing as a flower, so too, we believe our thoughts about life are life. The longer we live, the less we remember what it's like or that it's even possible to experience life directly, without all our thoughts and concepts in the way. We get comfortable interacting with life through the layer and lens of thought, interacting, that is, with the packaging of life, until ultimately we forget what we're giving up, forget what's inside the packaging. We lose touch with a direct, sensorial experience of being alive, forget that life, raw and uninterpreted, still exists. The flower, while perhaps describable and intellectually knowable, is still an ever-changing and, to some degree, incomprehensible or unknowable experience. The result is that we live at arm's length from our experience, from our life, waylaid in the shallows of description and interpretation. Life becomes an abstraction, an intellectual quagmire. But rarely, if ever, do we swim directly in the depths of life, stripped naked of our wetsuit of ideas. It bears repeating our thoughts about life are not life, but rather just descriptions, interpretations, abstractions, analyses, opinions, and everything else about life. Our thoughts do not contain the experience of the thing they're talking about. While our thoughts may make a lot of sense, help us get things done, frame and direct life in useful ways, still, our thoughts are just mental constructions, replacements for our experience, which ultimately cannot be captured or lived fully through thought. Directly experiencing a flower through our senses, being awed by it, is not the same as thinking about what kind of flower it is or what season it blooms in, and not the same as deliberating on the fact that we enjoy this flower or considering who we're going to give it to, or anything else about it for that matter. We start removing the layers of thought between us and life when we're ready, when we're courageous enough to stop turning every experience into a conceptual conundrum, and curious enough to see what's here when there's nothing to have to explain or know about it. It happens ultimately when we're willing to stop thinking every moment into an idea of itself. We hold tight to our thoughts about life because we don't trust or even know that life can be experienced in any way other than through thoughts, and through the me who is thinking them. But life can indeed be met directly, without all the layers of thought between us and it. We imagine that we are living a life, our life, as if life and who we are exist as two separate entities. But in fact, there is only one thing. We are inseparable from this thing we call life. We ourselves are life, part of its river. Consider for a moment, what if you are part of life rather than the one living it? What if there's no separate you and it? What if what you consider you, that is, all your thoughts and sensations, is also something arising in the larger consciousness? Feel what this contemplation stirs in your body. Walk with it. Live with it. Avoiding existential withdrawal. When you ask an addict if he can imagine life without his substance, he'll tell you absolutely, positively, never. Life without a fix is unfathomable. Reality, without a way out of it, without a way to create a different state of consciousness, would not be possible. An escape from reality is what an addict needs to survive reality. Similarly, if I asked you if you could imagine a life in which thinking were optional, or in which moments of no thinking could even happen, you would probably tell me that such a thought is unthinkable. We're open to thinking about not thinking, or thinking about how to control thinking. We love a good thought to chew on, but not thinking for real doesn't seem possible or even desirable. Not thinking is most definitely not a viable solution to the problem of thinking. And in fact, when we try to change our relationship with thought, reconsider the place of thinking in our life, our thoughts push back with their own brand of existential withdrawal. I think, therefore I am, surmised the 17th century philosopher René Descartes. And indeed, we feel a sense of ourselves, a sense of being alive when we're thinking, solving a problem, or any other mental activity. We know ourselves through the act of thinking. We are the ones doing it, after all. Every now and again, however, and more frequently if you have a meditation practice, you might notice a gap between thoughts, a space of quiet in your mind, a moment when you are not thinking. When you notice these gaps, notice not thinking, often we experience a kind of primal fear. The mind, realizing that it had momentarily stopped thinking, tends to panic. Our mind feels as if we disappeared and temporarily ceased to exist. When we stop thinking, we stop feeling our own presence in the way we're used to experiencing it. We stop experiencing ourselves as existing. Gaps between thoughts can be experienced as annihilation, but in fact, they are the doorways to our freedom, glimpses of another way of being, and the kryptonite to our thinking addiction. When we discover that we still exist even when we're not thinking, and that our own presence remains in the spaces between thoughts, then we can start to get more comfortable and curious in the gaps. Then we can break our reliance upon thinking as the only way to feel we actually exist. Exercise. Who's here now? Take a deep, slow breath. Relax. Tune into your senses. Feel the sense of just being. Notice what's here that doesn't rely on and isn't made of thought. Notice the presence that you don't have to think into existence. Contemplate. Who's here now? Interestingly, while we're in the actual experience of not thinking, we're not afraid. There's no thought of fear, no thought of a me that's missing. The self does not miss itself when we're not thinking. In these moments, you could say there's no self to be afraid. In the flow experience, when we're deeply engaged in a sport or creative activity, the one who's doing it disappears. The thoughts about what's happening fade away. We are absorbed fully into the experience itself. Life becomes something we're inside of, rather than something a separate I is making happen. The experience of linear time disappears, and we're swallowed up into now. Without thought, we are no longer separate from our experience, no longer separated from life. The instant we realize that we were not actively thinking, not here in the sense we normally experience ourselves, through our thoughts, that is, those same thoughts explode. Our mind screams, "What just happened? Where did I go? What does this say about me? What should I do about it? I've got to tell so-and-so about this," and 1,000 other thoughts about that moment when we were not thinking, not there. When we become aware of the gap, the space of being without thinking, we react by doubling down on thinking. We correct the existential terror that arises from having the idea of ourselves momentarily disappear from our consciousness. The sense of self-absence is thus replaced with a tsunami of thoughts, which then return us to a comfortable sense of ourselves, and one we know, the experience of ourselves that we achieve through the act of thinking. Back is the one thinking about not thinking. What's clear is that the thought of not thinking, to the mind, maker of thoughts, is anything but desirable. Our mind is not keen on less thinking, on getting comfortable without thought. The mind is positively not in favor of a self that's independent from thoughts. Asking the mind if it wants to drop out of thought is like asking a fisherman if he wants to move to the desert. "No," he says. "What would I do there?" Asking our thinking self to get comfortable without thought is like asking a raindrop to join and thus disappear into the ocean. "No," says the raindrop. "I want to remain a unique, separate, and knowable raindrop self. I want to remain as me, the raindrop." Not thinking, even temporarily, is tantamount to not existing. But it's precisely this thought that keeps us obsessively thinking. The next step, then, is to realize that you are bigger than thought.